So we're going to make this whole process relatively YouTube friendly. That's the plan. And a lot of it is really just going to be, we'll probably, first we'll talk a little bit about establishing sort of the baseline for what the design is going to accomplish. We'll go through how to refine that vision a little bit. And once we've gone through establishing the baseline and refining the vision, we'll start to put together some ideas that we think might accomplish those things. And then we'll just iterate on that process a few times, as many times as is necessary before we start to figure out A, what our vision actually looks like, and B, how we think we can accomplish that. That's basically the outline of a game design process, not including playtesting. Obviously, doing playtest plans and playtesting are going to be a big part of that, but we're not going to get into that stuff today. We're just going to do that first chunk. The idea hopefully will be to put together a pretty solid sort of hypothesis for what the game design is going to accomplish. And remember that the number one thing to remember about that is that the game design vision, one of the main purposes of a game design vision is for it to create a sort of falsifiable framework so that when we move forward, we have a really clear idea of whether or not we're succeeding on that design or not when we do move into the playtesting process, because we're basically trying to filter out the ability to let us get away with confirmation and bias and stuff like that in our iteration and our testing, because it's really easy, and I see this happen a lot. It's really easy to just be like, well, the point of this thing is to, make players feel like this, and it should ultimately be fun, right? It should ultimately be just like a fun thing. And then as long as the feedback from players is remotely positive, the designer just looks at that as a baseline success. There's no, nuance to the understanding. It's just success because players enjoyed. Done. We're going to be a little bit more rigid than that. We're going to be a little bit more thorough. And because I can't capture my fourth display, which is my tablet, we're just going to use a Google Doc. All right. So the first thing that we know, because I'm imposing this as a restriction, is that this is going to be a Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition magic item. The reason I want to go magic item, even though we had talked in the Elite chat about doing like an encounter, the more I thought about it, the more I kind of realized that that's massively overscoped for what we're trying to do, because we're going to take the design in little chunks and then talk about why we want to take that in that direction and what alternatives might be, and trying to make sure we're building good arguments for why we're proposing the designs we're proposing. So each tiny step of the process is going to be, I think, pretty long, and doing an encounter just has so many variables that it's not impossible to design an encounter. That would be ridiculous to claim, but I think, over the course of an hour or two, designing a magic item is about right. So the first thing we need to start with is our vision. And the vision the vision should encompass everything that we want to achieve with the magic item, right? Okay, so if that's our vision, that's our broad goal for the vision, right? We want to establish all of the things that we're trying to achieve with the magic item. However, we're not just making a magic item in D&D. We're going to approach it like proper professional game designers with good process, who are very rigid and strict in how we actually put together the design. So we have some criteria, some additional criteria. It can't just be, it's the vision. Sure, you just encompass what you want. Yeah. No. It's going to be a lot more specific, a lot more strict. We're going to talk about things like, how does the player who owns the magic item interact with it? Or alternatively, how does the player use the magic item? How does the existence of this magic item change the way the player interacts with other things, i.e. combat, non-combat encounters, etc. Basically, the idea here is that we're looking for, we don't want, this is not what we're trying to accomplish in this case. Bracers of Defense, which just gives +1 AC. Bracers of Defense are not what we're trying to accomplish here, and the reason we're not working towards something like Bracers of Defense is because Bracers of Defense they can work within the context of a much larger system and a bunch of other things that are going on, but Bracers of Defense by themselves do not fundamentally change anything that Bracers of Defense don't fundamentally change the way players interact with things really meaningfully, right? If you think about it in terms of bracers just give you +1 AC, right? So if you're a monk and using Bracers of Defense and you run in and you're being really in the thick of combat all the time, and then you get Bracers of Defense, you just keep doing that. And if you have some reason that as a monk that you aren't running into the thick of combat all the time, or you have some other loop that you're going through, getting +1 AC doesn't change that. There aren't really very many things that there are really not very many things that would take something like Bracers of Defense, or sorry, there's not very many things that would override that +1 AC, or that +1 AC would override that roll into meaningful decisions, right? As a player would never go, well, I was gonna do this, but now that I have this 1 extra AC, I'm gonna do this different thing. That will almost never happen, because 1 AC is never going to be enough to, like, for example, take a really passive player and have that player suddenly play really up front. Usually if the player is playing up front, they're playing up front. +1 AC doesn't really change that, and if they aren't, they aren't. Now, you might be able to make an argument this is why I said if you have other things going on in the system, +1 AC might do something. But then it becomes, yes, but if the player has this +1 AC item and also this other thing, like maybe you design a custom ability or something, then between those two things, that might change the way the player is interacting. But it's a good rule of thumb to think, if my players aren't meaningfully going to make different decisions based on what I'm giving them, I probably don't want to give them that. I probably want to rethink what I'm giving them. So when I say what we're designing here today is not going to be like Bracers of Defense, that's what I mean. We're going to try to really make sure that what's going on is a meaningful distinction between the way the player normally acts and the way they act now, or the way they act with this magic item. And then the things above that are just like, how are they using it? You know, those all basically come down to, in what context are we trying to change the decision? A player has a decision point already, so which of those decision points are we going to try to modify or alter? So that's kind of what I mean by these criteria. And this is really useful, because what this essentially does is this makes it so that when we start designing, when we start playtesting, we have super concrete criteria and a really specific understanding of how the player will actually behave. This, I'm going to write here, props, because this is our props model, essentially. The idea that your design should be predictive, just like a scientific hypothesis should be predictive, a design should be predictive. A really good design is predictive. So an example of a bad design in this case would be something like, my player, I have, to continue the Bracers of Defense example perhaps, maybe you have a monk and your monk is really struggling to, maybe you're not giving the monk a lot of short rests, right? If you're not giving the party a lot of short rests, the monk is down on key as they go through multiple encounters in a day, depending on how you run things. The monk is starting to be really ineffective in combat because the monk never has key points. What you don't want to do in a situation like that is go, So I should give the monk an ability that, a magic item that lets them get key points back. No, because your problems are more fundamental than that. If the monk isn't keeping up because you're underutilizing short rests, then the solution to that is to not underutilize short rests. And then we have a whole different conversation. If instead you're having, you approach this in terms of, I would really like it if the fighter had something to do as an action that wasn't just attack. Now that's really tricky because the fighter already is designed to basically be something that mostly hits stuff. So most of what they do is hit stuff. So in order to do that, we'd have to give them something that's a pretty attractive option. Contextually, that can matter. If you have a party that has absolutely no ability to get anybody up if they go unconscious, maybe you give the fighter something, although items can deal with that too. But the point is, you start to have a much clearer, more concrete understanding of this is what we're trying to accomplish with this magic item. One of my favorite sayings is that any design should always be a very specific solution to a very specific problem. So if you're not coming up with a very specific solution to a very specific problem, chances are you're not adhering to this principle and you're not adhering to our criteria that we're trying to follow today. Right. So, that having been said, how do you guys want to do this? What kind of magic item you want to make? This is when we can start just... So this is basically step one. We're going to start brainstorming. Because remember, these things, these criteria, these are not criteria that we have to start following immediately. They're criteria that we need to keep in mind as we construct the vision. But the process of constructing the vision isn't going to start with this. It's going to start with whatever. What do you want? We'll take the ideas that we brainstorm and then we'll forge them using the process of adhering them to these criteria. But first, we just do whatever you want. So if you have any ideas, just throw them out. Just throw them out. Whatever you want to do. This is actually very similar. I have a video on the class design where the way I started it was like, wild magic sucks. That's not, and it wasn't. I spent a lot of time in the video explaining, like, that's not my assessment of wild magic. That's not my analysis of a wild magic as a system. I don't like wild magic, and that's it. That's the whole thing. So the rest of it comes from basically that point. And eventually the vision for the design follows principles like this, but it doesn't start out that way. It starts out with just wild magic. I don't like it. So we can start anywhere. So if you have an idea, feel free to throw it out. Otherwise, I'll just start something. I have no idea what I'm going to design. I'll just start something. But if you have an idea, now's the time. Like, I don't know, maybe, you know what? Random item names is a perfectly valid starting point. The starting point, sure. Go nuts. Cubic gate. You know what? Let's just start, cubic gate. Okay. Sure, that's one. By the way, this is also, it's totally valid to start with narrative here if you like. It doesn't matter. Cubic gate. Cubic gate. Okay. Dragon Heartstone. These are very D&D names. Yes. Hilt of Pacifism. Okay. Sure. Yeah, no, keep them coming. These are good. We'll just start. I actually really like this process because we're starting somewhere pretty arbitrary. And actually, what's hilarious is when I design stuff for D&D, a lot of times I just start with like a name that I think sounds cool, and then I just start to figure out what that would be. It's a completely your starting point can be totally arbitrary. It's completely irrelevant. All that matters is the process that occurs afterward. But yeah, these are good. If you have any more, keep them coming. We've got 3 so far. Did I spell everything right? Yeah, I did. I'm actually a really good typist and don't really misspell things. Mr. Muffin, sure. But when I'm typing on stream, suddenly I'm like really paranoid that I'm gonna become like selectively illiterate. I wonder if selective illiteracy is a real thing. It probably is. I don't know what a monster is. I know what a muffin is. Oh, miffin. I said muffin, not miffin. I mean, I know Munster is a type of cheese. That's all I know about it. Munster, yeah. I mean, that's 5. That's not bad. We can always come back to them. If anybody else has any either item name ideas, feel free to throw them out. All right, so we've got 4 here, right? Yeah. You've got 4. We've got the Hilt of Pacifism, we've got the Munster Muffin, the Dragon Heartstone, and the Cubic Gate. I'm gonna cross this one out because I don't know what any of those words really mean. I mean, a miffin is like a baked good, isn't it? Isn't that a thing? But that leaves Cubic Gate, Dragon Heartstone, Hilt of Pacifism. So if you have any preferences, Cubic Gate is kind of, let's just go through them. Cubic Gate is kind of cool. It's got like a double meaning, right? You've got cubic like a cube, obviously, and then cubic like an algorithm, where you could have like a cubic graph. And then gate. So cube could refer to the item itself or the effect it creates. Gate is like a nice broad, very let's say malleable concept. Oh, well, you know, I wouldn't be surprised if there was a Dragon Heartstone 2. That sounds like a thing that would exist. Try to not press incorrect buttons as we do this. Not Dragon Heartstone is just a rock. Okay. You know what? I like Hilt. Okay. I thought it. Okay. Cool. That means I'm not crazy. Okay, so I think my votes are for either Hilt of Pacifism or Dragon Heartstone. Dragon Heartstone definitely sounds more dramatic. Hilt of Pacifism does start to lend itself a little bit more in terms of like what kind of thing it would probably do. I think you can more or less guess. I'd probably do something. That would clearly be something to do with like something non-combatant related. But you know, open-ended isn't necessarily a positive. Also in this case, because at the end of the day, we're going to have a design that does our thing. So we don't really necessarily need a lot of room to play with. And a lot of times, a lot of the really creative stuff comes from interesting constraints. So like a Dragon Heartstone is going to do almost anything. In fact, I'm going to say we're going to go with Hilt of Pacifism. Because I think it'll be interesting to work within the constraint of we're going to want something that the name is appropriate for. So that provides us some additional constraints, and that'll be a better, I think it'll probably make a better demonstration. So we're gonna design the Hilt of Pacifism. Now we have a slightly more okay. Yeah, okay, well, attacking. Okay, so the next thing that I was gonna do was we're going to do a slightly more focused brainstorming session where we just look at Hilt of Pacifism. What comes to mind? Don't worry too much about, you know, specifics yet. We're just sort of, this is almost like word association, basically. We can come back and start defining things more more clearly and more specifically later. So what about the hilt of pacifism? We've got attacking versus not attacking, the initial concept, or the initial, I guess, inspiration for it. We've got how about something about social interaction with the weapon, like a sentient weapon, with the decision points that revolve around the item as a quest giver. Let's say that. Okay. Okay. Makes enemies pacifies enemies. So basically, we've got either you don't attack, the enemy doesn't attack, or you can talk to it, and that creates other decisions. Does anybody have a preference on any of those things? And this is, again, these are all just preferences. It doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. This is when we talk about, as you've probably heard this idea. You've probably heard this idea of like the idea versus the execution. We're still in the idea phase, so most of what we do doesn't really matter. We're just coming up with the idea, and we'll start to get on the execution shortly. Sentient pacifist weapon sounds interesting. Okay. What about a sentient pacifist weapon sounds interesting to you? Okay. So it's comedic. Sure. Now, here's where the idea starts to become execution. Your starting point is I like the idea that it's just kind of funny to have a weapon that is it's a hilt, and you would like attach it to a weapon, but then the hilt is a sentient item, so it doesn't like that you're using it to attack. So the thing is, here's where we're starting to get into execution a little bit, right? If you like the idea that the decision points revolve, or that it's comedic, if you like the idea that it's comedic, when we start getting back into these criteria, what decisions are we trying to, what new decision are we trying to add, or what existing decision are we trying to modify or change? And I'd like to clarify there that even if you're like, no, it's just a story item, I don't accept that answer because I wouldn't accept that kind of answer, because if it's a story reason, then what we need to be doing as game designers is figuring out how that story can be told through gameplay and through gameplay decisions. So it's just story has always felt like a bit of a, like that's not a designer's solution. So, for example, if it was a magic item that just kind of yelled at you when you hit things. Okay. Convince the sword to attack. All right, no, that's getting pretty good, actually, because now we can start getting figuring out how we can get the sword to attack. Because now what we have is here's what we have is a player goal. We have a player goal, and that means that we're halfway toward creating We're halfway toward creating an interesting core tension. Ugh, I'm like scratching at my face a lot. It's spring allergies. Eyes are so itchy. Okay, so we want to convince the goal. So the goal is to convince the sword to attack. So now what we need to do, because that's a reasonably clear goal. Now we need to break it down a little bit further, and we want to, we're actually going to delete everything else. We're going to try to turn this into a core tension. And the way that we turn this into a core tension is this. Right? And then as we figure out, and then they want to look at the nature of the tension, which means that we're comparing the goal with the obstacle that we design. And then we'll try to define what the tension is between those two things once we start thinking of what different kinds of obstacles we can give. Right? So what are some obstacles? Well, actually, this is probably more like, hang on, let's rephrase that a little bit. Sword is something, but player must something to attack with it. Right? Basically, what we're doing is we need something that will incentivize the player to want to attack with a sword, because that creates the player goal of convincing the sword to attack. And then we need an obstacle, which we're gonna figure out. But the reason I changed the wording here is just to make it a little bit clearer in terms of like, hey, this sword has this property that makes attacking with it really valuable. Now, I would want to say, let's actually make these variables so that we can start playing with some stuff. Because the first thing that I think is A needs to be a part of the decision-making process. So again, I'm going to give you like a not. It's a plus a million to hit. Right? For the same reason that we didn't want the bracers, although it would be a lot better here because we're using the bonus to incentivize something else, which actually forces the tension point. But I think it'll make a lot more sense if it's a decision-making process, because then we can take this hilt of pacifism thing and really like build a lot of the combat around for that player around the sword. Well, all right, so sure. So the reason I'm saying like I don't necessarily want specific really clear bonuses like attack and damage is really simple. I am jumping ahead a little bit, but just to sort of show the process of why I'm hesitant to do that. It's because this is kind of how I see this playing out as we do this, right? Let's say we're just doing that, right? We make the sword do a lot of damage. I don't know how much. Let's just say 3d10, right, on a hit. Like it does a lot. Now we need to figure out what makes the sword, like how does the player convince the sword? Well, D&D 5e already has systems for this, right? So the first thing that you're going to think is, oh, it's persuasion. Right? You gotta make a persuasion check. You gotta like verbally convince the sword via arguments to attack. And that's going to be a persuasion check. But basically what that means is player with really high persuasion, especially expertise, trades their, let's say +7 to hit. Well, trades their to hit for their persuasion, which is higher. So now you just get to, now you get into the sticky situation where, well, our problem is that all that means is that the player just rolls persuasion instead of an attack. So it's just an attack, but you get better because you can expertise in your persuasion and with extra steps. And also you can use charisma, which means things like bards or heaven forbid, a hexblade warlock are insanely powerful with the sword, or a paladin. Oh my God. So this idea of like make it do damage, that puts us in a weird situation where once we do that, it's now we have to balance that. Because now before we've done all this, we've basically just gone, okay, the sword does a lot of damage. We need something to offset that. Providing material incentive, maybe. It would depend on the process by which you provide material incentive, because I can definitely see a world wherein now it basically just, you pay money to attack. And if you have gold, then this sword is nuts. And if you don't, then it's useless. What if, here, let me give you a counterexample, because I think I did a fairly poor job of explaining the issue with that. So let me give you a counterexample, and I think that'll make a lot of sense. So let's say instead of saying it does a lot of damage, let's say it does more damage the more rounds in combat you go without attacking at all. Like if the sword is attuned to you and you're not attacking, the sword does like, an extra 1d10 of damage for every round in that combat that you don't attack. Because what that can do is, if a sorcerer has it, for example, then like this sword is all about making it so that that caster or whatever, it doesn't have to be a sorcerer, sword is all about making it so that the caster is incentivized toward attacking in melee later on versus earlier on. If a fighter has it, may look for other action options. Grapple is a fun one. Maybe grapple. So I like grapple. It's a shame that it's so terrible in 5th edition. But we're starting to get somewhere a little bit more. The reason that approach, I wouldn't call it a better approach, strictly speaking, but it's definitely an approach that starts to create some decision-making process. And I still think there's a lot of refinement that this concept would need. Like, for example, what if you gave this to Blade Song Wizards wants this sword so bad. Right? Like a Blade Song really wants this sword. The other problem that you have is that this doesn't. The other thing is, I don't know why. I don't know how to undisable them. Hang on, I'll do them in a second. Do that in a second. So this is the opposite of implied pacifism. Now, here's the thing. A really easy solution to this problem is change the item name. Hilt of delayed gratification. Right? Done. We solved the problem. So it would be at a point like this that we would have to stop and go, all right. Do we want to drive this pacifism theme? Or do we like this direction and we need to refine it? Yes, but sure. Hilt of Patience works too. But we have a decision to make. Do we want to move forward with this design concept and then just kind of change the name, done? Or do we want to go back and go, we want to change we want to actually change the design, because the idea was to make a hilt of pacifism, because those would be very different things. And I need to figure out how to change. I figure out how to disable links. Let me go see how that works. There is a settings page. Aha. That's got to be in here somewhere, right? Oh, maybe not. Yeah, that works too. That's gonna kind of bother me, but yeah, all right. Yeah, I mean, that's a fair point given, and that actually, this is, by the way, if you've ever heard anybody talk about high level project goals, we're starting to get into that territory a little bit. We're not really, because we don't have a project, but the idea of like elevating the problem to the next level up of just going like, well, we have this assessment. Do we want to stick with pacifism or stick with this design? And it's a mostly subjective thing. We're just kind of like, which one do we like better? But it is worth noting, as you pointed out, that there is something we're attempting to accomplish here. And one of these things probably is better in terms of attempting to accomplish that thing. So in terms of the high level project goal, in this case, the stream, which is meant to be like a design exercise, taking the harder method might be a better approach. So that's actually a great example of like why I'm always pushing for looking at things as objectively as possible in design, because there's always an objective framing that you can find that will push you more toward your goals. Anyway, a little bit of a diatribe, but not a terrible one. Okay, so the main issue, we can make a quick note, right? We have a problem. This basically does the opposite of imply pacifism. Why does it do the opposite of imply pacifism? Well, because it ultimately incentivizes player to hit stuff, and pacifism is the opposite of that. So yeah, that's a problem, right? We've again, back to the objectivity thing. If our goal is to represent pacifism via player decisions, then a design that incentivizes attacking is objectively not a good design, right? Or maybe more accurately, more accurately, because the concept of a good design doesn't really make sense. That's qualitative. But yeah, I think that's a good. Yeah. Good. That's good. Okay. So then the next thing is, what do we do? What do we do about it? And this is perfect, right? This is a perfect example of. This is like a really perfect example of like how to. This is a perfect example of the concept of the specific design should be a specific solution to a specific problem, because you see how through the process. Oh, okay, yeah, I can recap that real quick. Basically, by giving the sword just flat additional damage and then making you go through a process to get the sword to attack, you create a situation where now you're basically forced into a position where you have to say, you have to balance that. You have to balance the damage output with the other thing that you do. And now we're in a weird position where we're already talking about balance when you don't even know what the design is yet, really. And that's usually a bad sign, because it means that you put yourself in a situation where you're basically just like, okay, let's make it so that it's hard to attack. And then how hard do you make it to attack? And it just, you're no longer in the realm of what are the decisions we're trying to drive and what is the player experience. We're in the situation of we wrote ourselves into a corner and now we're just desperately trying to work within that tiny space that we've crafted for ourselves, when it's usually almost always better to just take a step back and go, this process leads us into a place where we can't really assess the designs from the perspective of player decisions, which means that the process probably went wrong somewhere. But if we start thinking about it more in terms of, so a shorter way to say that, like the short version of that would be, the reason giving the sword a lot of damage wasn't the right call in this situation was because there was no reason to give it damage. That's like the short version. Giving the sword a lot of damage wasn't a solution to a design problem. It was something that we just kind of threw at the board. And then as we played that out, we realized that really doesn't serve much of a purpose here. But the short version is, it really just, it was a design that wasn't a solution to a specific problem. And that's why I like that phrase, because if you're always very careful about like, what problem am I currently solving and how does this design solve that problem, you want to, as soon as you notice that that's happening, you want to pull yourself back and kind of look at the process and make sure that that's not happening. Because if you do that once or twice without realizing it, you've created a foundation that's very shaky for the rest of your design, and you start to write yourself into corners and you have no way of getting out of them because you don't realize that you started writing yourself into the corner 8 design decisions ago, and now you're so far down the path that you can't even find where you started to go wrong. And that happens very quickly and very easily because design is just straight up really hard. Like, that's just, when I teach, that's the thing that I do a lot, is I'm always like very careful to stop when we're going through a process, especially like this, and just say like, hey, just as a reminder, don't forget that design is actually a good design with proper process is actually legit hard. Design is really difficult. It's a difficult craft. Just like any other craft, really, if you know what you're doing, it's tough. So I would say try not to get discouraged, because we're going to run into a lot of walls like this, a lot, because design is just hard. Anyway, that was another diatribe, but you know what? I like that one. I like the design is hard talk. I think some people have found it very reassuring. I always find it really reassuring when I'm struggling with something, just be like, it's fine. I'm not stupid. Design is just hard. It's just very difficult. Takes work. Anyway, so we have this whole idea of the sword, and also, and basically where we left off with the design was here, was here. If our goal is to design a pacifism item, an item that represents the concept of pacifism, and we incentivize the player to use it to attack, that's not pacifism, right? We're not doing our jobs. And we have added the additional constraint that, yes, the sword does indeed need to be pacifism, as per our high-level goal conversation, high-level project goals conversation. So that leaves us with, I think, a very clear, very specific question. But I would be interested before I continue, because I just talked a lot straight. So before I continue, I'm curious, what do you guys think the next question is? Because remember, I'll give you one last thing, which is, I did a much longer post on this in GDA, but basically, every time you're doing anything, whether it's design or analysis or anything, and you come up with an answer. You have a statement. That statement has a question behind it. Usually that's a tacit question, which means that it's just a question that you didn't consciously think of, but the question still exists somewhere. So one of the really important things that you need to do in a process that'll really help you improve dramatically, whether you're doing analysis or design or really with anything, is to really make sure that you're careful about going, here's the questions I'm answering. And that this, by the way, this whole like a design should be a very specific solution to a very specific problem. That whole thing is really all about just saying, what is the problem you're solving? What is the question you're answering? So before I continue, I would like to know, based on all the things that we've just done, what do you guys think the question we should be answering is? Okay, let's put that down. How do you convince a person who is a pacifist to fight? You know what? Let's break that down. Let's try to break that into some assumptions, because there are some tacit assumptions with that. What assumptions does that statement make? Or does that question make, rather, I should say? All right, let's do that. Let's add that one too. Why? A lot of, because both of these questions come with a number of assumptions. I think we can be probably even more. Okay, yeah, so yes, that question definitely does assume that the goal is still to specifically convince the sword to attack. Which isn't necessarily something that we need to have in our design. It was part of the initial vision, but if you've ever heard the phrase, don't be afraid to kill your babies, this is where that phrase starts to apply, because the vision is going to change and alter so much over the process of the design that little things like that, like the initial inspiration for the idea, you need to be willing to just throw that in the garbage. Because maybe it's not the right approach. It might have gotten you to the initial idea, which then provides context so that we can assess and analyze and make sure that the design is internally consistent and all that. But once we start doing all that, and once we start getting through that process, the initial inspiration, the thing that sparked that inspiration, no longer relevant. Remember, this is the difference between the idea and the execution. And execution is everything. And you'll hear people say that all the time. Execution is everything. This specifically is what they mean. This very specific thing that's happening right now. I think, because remember, here's what I'm thinking, right? If our goal is to prevent pacifism via player decisions, then a design that incentivizes attacking objectively fails to accomplish that goal. I think that's a fair statement to make. It's an objective statement. That doesn't necessarily mean it's an objectively true statement, but it is definitely an objective statement. You can make an argument for and against it, and someone would be right and someone would be wrong. But what I'm thinking is, what is pacifism? Right? Like, don't we need to define that? And I don't mean like Webster's dictionary define. I mean, we need a definition of pacifism that is all about player decisions. Because we could and this is important, because we're not trying to build an absolutely true definition of pacifism. We're trying to build a framework for pacifism that will allow us to build a design around it. And we do want it at the end of all of it. We want that process to feel like pacifism to the player, right? Because pacifism the way that this has been going on, pacifism seems very much to be like, this is the key word in our player experience, and we want it to feel like pacifism. So now we have to ask, how do we make the player make decisions that feel pacifistic? So, for example, I am being attacked. The most convenient, let's say, option for me is to fight back. I instead decide to do something that is not fighting. Is that, can we make that something feel more like pacifism? And by that, I mean, when we have the player go through that process, that thought process, is there something that they can do instead of fighting that feels more like pacifism than anything else that they could do instead of fighting? Like, for example, i.e. maybe saying, I forgive you, troll, feels more pacifistic than running away, for example. Now, I don't know if that's true. I'm just trying to put together a statement that looks like the kind of thing that I think we should be aiming for. Okay, this is a good option for a good time for more brainstorming. Yeah, so let's do, wait, let's talk this out. So, basically what we're saying is, player is strongly incentivized to resolve conflicts without violence. Okay. Yeah, it is kind of the opposite of murder hobo parties. Now, I would also say, just as a point, because we're designing for D&D 5th edition specifically, this is going to be a major problem. I'm not sure if a magic item is up to that task. That seems to me something just intuitively. I'm not really making an argument here. I'm just saying, like, intuitively, it feels like we may not be able to do a magic item that does that, because we're actively working against all of 5th edition, because every rule in 5th edition is how to murder things. And hey, things are going to be murdering you, so you better murder them before they murder you. Otherwise, you're going to get murdered. That's the whole rule set, is that. So I don't know if a magic item is enough, although I wouldn't say it's impossible. I would just say it would be insanely difficult to counteract all that with a single magic item, without then also invalidating, like, all of the system. Okay, we can do that. So pacifism will be defined in that case as sort of like the spread of nonviolence, i.e. person who was attacking me stopped attacking me. I mean, I could definitely see that happening. Something like, here's the map before. So see, now we're starting to get somewhere. Now we're starting to build. The ideas are starting to build on top of each other, right? So now we have something like, whenever whenever you, I'm not going to write a real rule here, but whenever you take the disengage action on your turn, you can. I'm not going to write out a real rule. I'm just going to put together a couple quick steps. You can, as part of the same action, and instead of moving, talk to a creature next to you, whatever. That creature spends its reaction listening to you. You have advantage on persuasion checks against that creature until the end of your turn. Right, something like that. Yeah, let's give it full advantage. See, so this is obviously a very rough rule. But the idea, so there's two things in this that I think might work. One is it requires that you take the disengage action, which means you're not. Yeah, basically they feel more compelled to actually listen to you. Yeah, they're more receptive. So first of all, the fact that it requires that you take the disengage action means you're using your action, which means that you're not going to do this and then attack generally. Or until you attack them or hit them with something or whatever. Aggression, basically. We can figure out what the actual rule would be later. But basically we want it so that you can't just like, we're trying to remove the ability to we're trying to remove the ability to use it as a like tactical step in your turn in order to be able to kill them more effectively. However, one thing that's important to note here that I actually like, but I'm not, the objective statement about it is this will allow your allies to attack with more effectiveness. Because it uses the creature's reaction. Right, so you could hypothetically use this as a tactical element in combat to say, use your action in order to remove the enemy's action. Like, let's say you have a caster and the enemy has counterspell, for example, right? They have a really valuable reaction that's hamstringing your mage friend. You could use this in order to occupy their reaction. But in doing so, you don't attack. And it would be really interesting if this was a weapon. It is a weapon. It does 0 damage. Like, it's a weapon. It does 0 damage. And then while wielding this weapon, you can do the thing. You do that. You have that ability, right? Something like that. The idea being like, oh, actually, it should be like, kind of like that. So you have a sword, and it's actually a sword, and it's a sentient sword, and then we can add flavor to that, where the flavor is like sentient sword gets mad at you if you attack with it, and refuses to do damage. Like, it's a regular sword, but if you attack with it, it just decides, nope, I'm not going to do any damage. It just can do that for whatever reason. Magic reasons. So now we're starting to get somewhere that I think is pulling a lot of the ideas together, a lot of your ideas about like how this is going to work in terms of enabling someone else to resolve the conflict in some way, making sure the enemy hears them out, giving your allies a bonus, but it doesn't give your allies a bonus in terms of like a plus to hit bonus. It gives the allies a bonus in the sense that you could strategically use this to remove somebody's reaction. And then flavor 2 is if you carry this sword on your person but don't equip it, i.e. if someone is just gonna have it for when they need it, you get some detriment. Every attack does 1d4. Every attack you make against a creature does 1d4 psychic damage to you. Something like that, right? Like, as long as you have it like in your pocket, like if you have it in a bag of holding with you or something, and you're attacking with other weapons, the sword like yells at you and says, don't be evil, don't murder. And you take psychic damage every time you attack. So you have to make the conscious decision of, I am never going to be a pacifist. Like, I refuse to be pacifistic. I don't want this sword. I like that because then even the sort of refusal of the magic item has significant implications, and I like it when magic items have that, because sometimes players are just not going to be interested. Anyway, yeah, I mean, what are your thoughts so far? Yeah, that'd be pretty good. The sword is like, it's just like lecturing you on moral philosophy all the time. That'd be pretty good. I don't know. What's everyone's? How does everyone feel about this so far? Changes you'd like to see. How do you think? More importantly, how do you think this will impact the player's decision-making process? Because remember, it's fun. It's fun to design things as a player, with a player mindset. It's fun to do that because you can imagine all the fun ways people could use this and go, oh man, we could do this and this and this. We have the sword to have this flavor, and I definitely indulge in that a little bit too with the flavor stuff. But we're gonna want to pull it back, right? You want to pull it back and always remember to go, we're designers, we're game designers, we're all professional here, or at least we're gonna act professional, and we're gonna think about it in terms of what gameplay decisions this creates. What classes might use this sword? What kinds of classes might have it and might use it? And what circumstances might they use it? And what tensions and decisions does this create? It creates a couple new decision points. That's nice. It creates an interesting tension of like, well, you can't attack, and that's actually a huge problem for your party, right? Action economy is really important. So I don't know. What are your thoughts with regard to like the decision points and the tensions you think it creates? Get some water. While that goes through. So with a detriment while carrying, players normally choose to stow this sword away. Well, what I meant by this, or no, what I meant by this, like, as long as the sword is like around you, or I guess I should say as long as you're, maybe like as long as you're attuned to it or something, right? That could be attunement. That might just solve that, right? If it was just attunement, that way you'd have to basically make a decision to attune or not, and if you're not attuned, you could never use it for anything. The main thing is like, you know, pick a lane. Yeah. Oh, sure. Yeah, a bard could probably make good use of this by using their action to, especially a bard, because you could grab expertise and persuasion, have advantage. I think it'd be really interesting to try to. Yeah, I think it'd be really interesting. There's probably some other stipulations we should add to the rules, but I'm not worried about the specifics of the rules yet, though. You would probably want things like, you know, the creature has to have like an intelligence of 6 or higher or something, or has to be able to understand you, right? Something like that. But yeah, I think a bard would probably make good use of it. Healer, maybe not so much, because a healer may not use actions to attack much, but a healer is using their action a lot to prevent damage and heal. A bard, definitely. I mean, cutting words is a bonus action. I know cutting words is a reaction, and inspiration is a bonus action. And having an attack like this would be really cool. That would be like really interesting to just try to convince people. It's kind of like it's a little bit like having suggestion and trying to cast suggestion in combat, except with a little bit more specific of an interaction. And also anybody can do it. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's interesting too. I think it's interesting to have the idea that it kind of. I think this is a good start. The next step here, if we wanted to go with this, the next step would be to just like write up the rule. And by the way, this is good. these are good statements. These are good points to make, because things like healers and bards might use it. I disagree that healers would use it, but I agree that bards would probably use it. But that's really useful, because those kinds of conversations mean, all right, you think healers might use it. I don't think healers would use it. But if we playtest that, and we playtest it in a controlled environment, and we see how often healers take it and use it, right? Again, it's we're both making objective design statements. One of us is right, one of us isn't. We could test it. That's the point of objectivity in design, is testability. And the idea of like someone would use this, like the idea that someone would use it in order to trade their action for an enemy's reaction in specific circumstances, but those circumstances are, so the question becomes like, are the circumstances common enough that someone would be willing to give up basically ever attacking? It may be that that's too much. It may be that as we go back, like the sword doing 0 damage is too much. It might just get to the point where, like, yes, that makes the most sense thematically in terms of pacifism, but in terms of design, it's just way too much, and now nobody ever uses it. That would be a genuine concern that I would have moving forward with this design. And these are all the kinds of things we'd look for in playtesting. But the next step here would be to write up like what that playtest would look like. And writing up what the playtests look like is this, but more of it, where we're just looking at how do we expect players to interact with this, how often do we expect players to use it. We may, with an item like this in particular, we may even do something like, let's say we're designing a module and this magic item is in it, we might give you this weapon and then also a couple other magic items, thinking like, yeah, we only expect 10 to 15% of parties to have a player who would ever actually use this weapon, but maybe that's okay, right? Maybe we don't care that players are constantly using it. Maybe that's because again, getting the option and being provided with the decision of, do you want this sword that makes you a pacifist, or do you want to keep killing things? That has implications, and a game or DM can do stuff with that if they want. So maybe that's fine. So maybe it's fine that it's only 10 to 15%, or maybe we decide that we want it to be more. Maybe we decide that it makes more sense that we want more players to be taking it, and then trying to convert players into pacifism, and we can shift the design over time, over iterations, as we get that playtesting feedback. And so the next steps would be to get a big list of all of the things that we sort of problems we anticipate, how we anticipate players interact with it, how we anticipate players to not interact with it. That's actually also a useful thing to do. Specific things that we expect we'll never see, that if we did see them, that would indicate that our design isn't working correctly. Like, for example, if we did make this like, it's 1d4 damage, right? It's really low damage for a sword, and especially if it's like a long sword. If people are taking the sword and then using it to attack all the time, I would expect that they would not take the sword and use it to attack all the time, because if they wanted to attack, they'd just use a regular longsword. We may have to buff things. I don't know. We may have to buff things. I think that comes down to how much do we want people to use the sword? Because here's another thing that you might see with the sword, or another design goal that you could have, is maybe designing a magic item that just incentivizes a player to play totally pacifistically, right? A magic item like this could be something that you give to a player who wants to be a pacifist, but in D&D that's not really a thing. But maybe you could just drop them a sword like this at like level 1. Because that's the other thing, right? If this is an uncommon magic item, that's probably fine. If we wanted to make it like a rare magic item, those are or higher, then we'd for sure have to start buffing those effects. There's a lot to don't get me wrong. I'm not saying this design is close to done. Not at all. I think there's plenty of concerns to bring up. with regard to how it might function. And those are all perfectly valid things to be worried about, and interesting conversations to have, right? Like, I would absolutely, if we were running a game team and I was your design lead, and you guys both said like, well, I think we should buff it because making it 0 damage completely incentivizes not attacking with it. So I think we need to up the effects. And then you were like, oh, well, I think it's meant to be niche. You could have that conversation, and it would be probably a really productive design conversation, because you have very, very clear ideas of how the different designs are going to play out, or might play out, or should play out. Not really. Monks want their actions. Monks want to be punching stuff most of the time, and they get extra attack at 5th. So. Yeah, I mean, and that's another. Maybe you could make like a cool monk subclass to go with it. But the main thing that I wanted to highlight is just that, like, look at the kinds of design comments that you're making, and think about how meaningful and productive the conversations surrounding those comments would be, and then consider how the process that we used all the way from the very beginning results in comments like that, and how clear and clean and specific those comments are, because that's and predictive, and that kind of objectivity, predictivity, props, the props model, those kinds of things are possible, even natural, because of the process that we've gone through in order to generate the design. Right. So it's less about the design that you generate. As a designer, you want to be thinking less about the design in terms of its end result, and more about the design in terms of the process that you're using and the kinds of questions that the process is raising, because that's what allows objectivity to flourish in the design process. That's the main thing. To me, that's like the number one thing that this has shown. And that's the number one value that something like this has for showing. Highly recommend using processes like this in your own designs. And if nothing else, hopefully this will get you to think twice the next time you want to cut some corners, which of course you do all the time. And that's because you're a human being, and human beings, we love cutting corners so much. So we love it a lot. I find myself doing that all the time. And it's always really important if you want to generate a really solid design. And another distinction that I'd like to make is, are you designing D&D stuff because you're having a blast designing D&D stuff, and you don't care if you're designing like correctly, like designing like a designer? Then go nuts. Like, if you're just doing it because it's fun, just keep doing it for fun. But if you want to master the craft of design and apply design as a craft, even to something like designing a magic item for a D&D game, you want to make sure that you have this really rigid, structured process where you're really being really careful about the questions that you're asking, and always making sure that you're asking questions that you think will generate really concrete answers that comport with the props model. And props, again, is, predictiveness, recreatability, objectivity, and specificity, and I always forget the second P. That's bad. What's the second P? I'm totally blanking. I need to look it up. Have it written down somewhere. I don't suppose Kelvin's around and knows. That would be really helpful right now. Let's see. I've got it here somewhere. Practical. Oh, it's practical, recreatable. Yeah, it's practical, recreatable, objective, predictive, and specific. That's what the 5 are. Props. And your design statements should generally be all 5 of those things. Like that's sort of the goal. Most of the time, you're not going to hit all 5, especially early on in the process. But by the end of the process, in particular, you want to be hitting all 5 of those. The design should be predictive, and we've gone over what predictiveness in design looks like by just now. You want it to be practical. You want your questions to be practical. You want the statements to be practical in the sense that this is actually the statement that we're making about the design is something that will actually impact the design in terms of how it impacts player decisions. That's what practical means. Highly specific. And I think a good example of that is when we defined pacifism and how we took the concept of pacifism, which is kind of an abstract idea, and defined it in like a concrete set of decisions, basically, and thoughts, and defined it as like, and we went, all right, pacifism isn't really that's not really the target for the design. It is, but it's the experiential target. This is the emotion that we're designing for. And we looked at pacifism as a feeling and what it feels like to be pacifism, to be pacifistic, and then how like decisions make you feel that way. So that's how we got more specific. It's objective. I probably don't need to go over how we've been objective because we've gone over that 2 or 3 times of like, this is what objectivity is and how objectivity is working. And recreatability just means that when we implement a process like this or a part of the process, you should be able to take that process and implement it in another design. And because it's a useful process, if you use the exact same process for the exact same goals, you should get the same basic results. Maybe not necessarily in the design, but with the player experience for sure, and with the player behaviors. So props is a useful model to weigh things against, and we've done pretty good. Like we've probably nailed 4 out of the 5 in this process, and we've barely started. We could take that process and push forward and figure out more. We'd obviously want to write up the rule. We'd want to write up the actual rule, and we'd start getting into the more specifics of in what circumstances exactly does this work and in what circumstances doesn't. How do you use it exactly, and then figuring out how that works with other rules and the wording on it. Then you'd want to start playtesting using the predictions that you've made with how the rule is supposed to play out, and then you iterate. And then you iterate, and the iterations are always going to be, we'll just go back to the same process. We're always being really objective, really specific, and continuing to be predictive. It is very rigid, just like the scientific model. The design process is very, 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 very rigid. And I think it's a bit counterintuitive because what we're designing for, in effect, is feeling and emotion. But this is how we can kind of break that down. Yes, you weren't here for this. You weren't here for this part of it, but yes, we kind of went over that a little bit, where we got to the point where it's like, okay, we want to convince the sword to attack, which isn't pacifistic at all. So we have a decision here, right? We could easily solve this problem by just changing the word. Oh, I kept the word delayed in there. By changing hilt of pacifism to hilt of delayed gratification or hilt of patience or something like that, right? We could just change the name, and that solves that problem completely. But of course, if we go back down to this statement about how if our goal is to represent pacifism via player decisions through this magic item, we have objectively failed at that goal. We might be succeeding at another goal, but we've objectively failed at this goal. And then we just decided, based mainly because of the goal of the stream, that it probably made more sense to go with the thing that was a little bit more restricted, a little bit harder, because it's easy to just change the name of something, right? No problem. But also, if you weren't in the context of the stream, you might decide, like, I really love the way this magic item works, and even though it's not necessarily my original vision, it's great. And you just change the name. Yeah, no problem. No one's ever gonna know. Your players will never know. It doesn't matter. Yeah, so unless there are any final statements or questions, I'm good. I'm done. I think we made really good progress. I mean, obviously, this isn't the whole design process. That would be insane to try to break down over the course of an hour and a half. I'm definitely glad we didn't do a full encounter. That would have been too much. But in the last few minutes, if anybody, any questions, comments, anything like that. For anybody watching who isn't already, definitely join the Discord. I can get you a link. I'll put the link. Let me put the link in. I think I can put the link in. Boom. Yes. So go ahead and join the Discord if you haven't already. Our game design Discord. Very, very wonderful place to discuss game design. If you found, by the way, if you found this useful, we are currently looking for testimonials in the server. That would be really, 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 really helpful to us. It's really helpful. For a whole bunch of reasons. And that's it. That's an excellent question. That's a really excellent question. I like to follow the idea that balance is nonsense. Now, it's not really. This is really important because it's not actually nonsense. Balance is actually a really useful tool. But it's not the appropriate tool to be applying most of the time. When it is the right tool to be applying, you really need to apply the tool of like looking at it in terms of balance. But most of the time, you don't want to do that. A lot of times, you want to look at it in terms of, well, basically, it's the things we have already been talking about in terms of what is the problem that you're solving. And if you're like, I want to give the sword a buff, why? Because I don't know. You tell me. Why did you want to give the sword a buff? Stream delay makes things a little bit awkward sometimes. Right. Right. Okay. So that's actually a phenomenal example of the difference between generating conflict or generating tension in your game design and working within the nature of that tension. And what happened is you have the right inclination of I want to make tension. It's the right instinct. I want to create tension. You should want to create tension. You do need to create tension, but you need to be working within the nature of that tension. And that's why we started with this up here and why I made this definition here, because A needs to be part of the decision-making process, right? Sword is A, but player has to do something to attack with it, because just making it so that you either you attack or not, you have to be considering what is the nature of that tension and what is the decision the player is actually making. Another good example of the nature of the tension would be something like you as a designer might be able to say, this room has a bunch of treasure in it, but a bunch of enemies. And this room has very little treasure in it, but it's just a throughway and they can continue on with little effort. But the players hit the crossroad and they don't know what's in either room. So as the designer, you're thinking, the tension is you can either go left or right. And there is a tension, right? There is a tension there. Left or right. There is a decision. But you have to decide whether the nature of the tension warrants the cost of complexity, warrants the cost of design time, warrants the cost of creating the right feedback for the players and giving them all the information. Because otherwise, they're just going, do we go left or right? And it's a totally arbitrary decision. Now, the attack versus non-attack isn't as arbitrary because it's a little bit clearer, but it's very similar in the sense that it's not really about attacking or not attacking. It's about what you get out of not attacking versus what you get out of attacking. And that's what, as a designer, you need to be really careful about, is what is the actual decisions the players are making versus what is the decision the players appear to be making. Players are concerned with what is the decision we appear to be making. A designer is concerned with what that decision actually implies. And usually you're going to want to connect those things so that the player is clear on what that means and what the implication of that is. But for sure, as a designer, you need to know that. Whereas for the player, they get to take it for granted because it's the designer who put in all the work to make sure that those things were connected. So your initial question of how do you avoid that is, it really comes down to making sure that you're being very clear about what your core tension is. And again, solving a very specific problem. And the more specific the problem, the more likely you are to be on the right track. So if the problem is just generally, well, the player is going to always want to use, is going to never want to use the sword, or is going to always want to use the sword, either one. Then the problem that you're facing is not a very specific design problem. The problem that you're facing is my vision isn't clear because you don't know what the nature of that tension should look like. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. I think I jumped around a lot there, but hopefully that makes sense. And then the balance thing, I would say, is just a nice sort of it's a nice rule of thumb to say, like, I shouldn't have to worry about balance. If you're worried about balance before you're pretty far into the testing phase, you're probably dealing with it too early. Not necessarily, but it's a good indicator that you might be. And balance is just 99% of the time it's not useful. I would say it's also really important to remember that balance is not the end goal of a design. And this is something that is sort of particularly relevant to D&D design because especially when I see on like you can go on like the homebrew Reddits or the Unearthed Arcana subreddit where people are giving feedback for designs for homebrew stuff, and almost every single comment has to do with balance. And all of the positive feedback, all the praise I see is always like, oh my god, somebody put a balanced homebrew class up on the homebrewery. And it always is a little bit cringe for me because there's just this sort of unspoken assumption that balance is the end goal of design. It is not. Balance is one of your many tools that can be usable in very specific circumstances, provided you know exactly what you're trying to accomplish and what balance even means in the context of what you're doing. It is a useful tool, for real. It's definitely useful. Multiplayer designers, no hate mail. It is. So the way I like to, it is arbitrary. The way I like to think about it basically is balance is a way of taking a situation where, because of the way the numbers kind of work out, player experiences are sort of starting to step on each other's toes, right? Like, so let's say, for example, fighters got extra attack at 3rd level, and then they got their second extra attack at 5th level. Now there's no reason to ever play a barbarian. Okay, you could survive better, but you're getting so horrendously outpaced by a full fighter at early levels. Or better yet, anytime you play a barbarian, you really have to try really hard to justify not dipping 7 levels into fighter or dipping 5 levels into fighter to get double attack, double extra attack, because it's better than everything else in terms of just hitting a lot. So balance is the problem isn't it's imbalanced, right? Oh, these things aren't balanced is not the problem. Balance is a solution of, hey, right now we have a huge an over preponderance of people either dipping 5 levels in fighter on every melee class, or just going pure fighter from the beginning because they get a ridiculous number of attacks and they out damage everything and they can still do a ton of damage. So it's really difficult for anybody to justify being anything other than that. So how do we solve that? Well, in this case, we nerf fighter. So balance is the solution to that problem. But the problem is actually that the experiential aspect of barbarians, paladins, whatever, monks, whatever, is not being fulfilled because fighter fills all of those roles just better. So we have balance as a solution to the problem, but imbalance is never the problem. And that's another one of those statements that like isn't technically true, really. And I bet if you said that to a bunch of multiplayer designers, they would be like, hang on. But I think it's a useful sort of heuristic, just a useful framework to think of it in terms of, okay, balance is never the problem, but it can be the solution. And yes, that effectively comes down to working on balance too early is arbitrary because you're not using it to solve a problem. Again, balance, just like any design, should be a very specific solution to a very specific problem. All right, anything else? Anything else anybody wants to cover? Apparently, if you ask like one sentence of a question, I'll just talk for 10 minutes. So if that's content, if that's the kind of content you're here for, then oh man, it's a good day for that. I'll just give it a minute for the chat to make sure that that I'm not just behind on the chat. But I think we might be about to close it out. I think that sounds like looks like we're about done. All right. Once again, if you haven't joined us on Discord, join us on Discord. The link is in the chat. Again, pop in a testimonial. Always super awesome. Always wonderful. Always very, very pleasant. We're very, very grateful for testimonials. And thanks for hanging out. Thanks for coming and being part of our wonderful little weekly event. Next week, we've got Kelvin doing an event, a portfolio review. And I think after that, we've got some pretty good stuff planned. I don't want to say anything just in case things fall through or whatever, but we've got some good stuff coming up for a couple weeks. And I think Kelvin is going to do some stuff. And then after that, I'll be back for more sort of this pure design theory stuff. Thanks everybody for hanging out. I'm done. We're good. Okay. Goodbye. See you on the server. Where's my button? I gotta find my button. Ah, ha, ha. Goodbye.